continue our seminar, as we continue the Next Move seminar, I also wanted to let you know that if you're watching this online, are we streaming right now? Give me a thumbs up if we're streaming. Okay, if you're watching online, tomorrow night is your last opportunity to come in person and get your free book, because everything that we have done here in this seminar is in this book. All the great graphics that you might be interested in, they're all right there. And so I'm inviting you to come tomorrow at 4 o'clock and 5:15 to see the conclusion of this seminar. But if you are planning on staying at home, we're welcoming you there as well. So welcome tonight, both everyone here and the streaming audience. It's great to have you here as we continue this series on church history. Let's begin tonight with the word of prayer. Father in heaven, as we now look again at the time of Constantine and look to how the church had radically changed as a result of our association with this emperor, I pray that you would help us see how this church at the end of this period of time would have been something that the first century Christians would not have recognized. I pray that you would help us see that we need reforming. The church needs to be reformed. And I pray tonight that you would help us as we understand these things and study tonight together. In Jesus' name, amen. So tonight, as I had said, we're going to look at how Constantine molded the Christian church into the image of the Roman Empire. Interesting. So in order for us to do that, we'll start with the Roman Empire and then we'll move to the Holy Roman Empire, because when Constantine began his work, it was called the Roman Empire. But when he left the scene, and as we ended the era that I'm going to call that era, it was the Holy Roman Empire. So it actually changed during this time. Let me give you a picture to show you what it was like. The apostolic era was when the apostles lived, and a little bit after that, when there were people who knew an apostle or knew someone who knew an apostle. In other words, there was the memory of the apostles, and as a result, there was a memory of their teachings and a memory of all these things. But that ended when Constantine came to fore. When in 313 AD, Constantine legalized Christianity, and as giving it legal status, he then became the head of it. He became the Pontificus Maximus of Christianity, where before he was that for the pagan religions. And as he began to favor certain groups within Christianity, he also began to mold it. I always look at it like this. If the Roman Empire was a mold, or some type of mold, and the Christian church was soft clay, then Constantine pushed the Christian church into the mold of the Roman Empire, baked it, and by the time you get to the end of this imperial era, that I call the imperial era, from 313 AD to 538 AD, you could just take that thing and pull it out, and the Christian church was set in form. Hard. And guess what, friends? What Constantine did is still seen in the churches today. Literally, how he changed our church is part of the 21st century church's structure even. And so let's take a look at that tonight. And the person we'll be asking as we go together and learn this is going to be, back up here, is this historian. We're going to be looking a lot at the historian, Professor Lars Qualbein. He is one of these famous church historians. In his book, A History of the Christian Church. Hope you can get that. It's one of the really premier, older, actually, last century histories of the Christian church. So I hope you can get that. So from his book, I'm going to share with you, for us to understand how Constantine changed things, we have to understand the worldview Constantine had as he became a Christian. So let's take a look. Back up here. Some facts about the religious beliefs of the Romans. Here's an important thing. If you've ever wondered, what was the religion like in the Roman Empire before Christianity, you're about to find out. Dr. Qualbein writes that the Roman religion was abstract, it was practical, it was formal, and it was legalistic. So let me explain what I mean by that. The gods that these people worshipped, all these different polytheistic gods, they promised no future rewards, they promised no punishments, and no anything in this life. What they were, according to Qual Bean, was, I'll try this again. They constituted a crowd of oppressive beings who constantly interfered with the human affairs, and therefore it was necessity to obtain the favors of these gods as a practical means of getting along in life. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that in just a second. In fact, we're going to look at what Roman religion was like. Okay. The Roman looked upon religion as sort of a contract between him and the gods, and if he kept his part, the gods would be bound to keep their part. So the Roman person was one who knew the ritual and then observed that ritual very carefully. That's how their religion worked. And a perfect example of this is to look at the god Terminus. Now, Terminus was the god of the property boundary. And this is why I'm saying it's abstract, it was practical, it was legalistic. Because imagine for a moment that you and I were neighbors, and back in those days, and we had a property boundary. So what would happen is we would put this god Terminus on our property boundary. It typically looked like a male from about the waist up, and he would be sitting there on the property boundary. And what would happen is once a year, you and I would come together and we would have sort of a party, and we would do a ritual in honor of the god Terminus. And then we would hope that we would then be okay and our property line would be safe. So the reason they were oppressive beings is, imagine if something happened with the property line. Say your neighbor decided to build a shed on your property. Well, then that must mean that the god Terminus was angry at you and you needed to do something. You didn't observe the ritual correctly. You forgot to do this right. And so you had to do something about it. That's why it's very legalistic. That's why you had to know the ritual very carefully, because that's how it worked. It was practical, legalistic, and it was very ritualistic. But now, one of the interesting things about the Roman religion is that everything in the Roman religion centered on the state. The government was part of the religion. And there's some facts I'd like to share with you, is that religion was so closely interwoven with the affairs of the state that there was a religious patriotism amongst the people that had no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world, according to Qual Bean. And so there was no group of priests, if you will, that performed these things. Who you would see publicly performing these rituals for whatever god they were doing it with was the government official. They would be the ones seen publicly as the head of the religious ceremonies. And of course, the major public figure was the emperor, and he was called the Pontificus Maximus, or the head of the religious affairs of the state. And this is interesting. Before 31 BC, this was the god Jupiter. So they used to have him be the Pontificus Maximus, but their religious patriotism, eventually what they did was they started saying that the emperor himself was a god, and they basically made the official head of the state a god himself. So you can kind of imagine that kind of, if you can imagine that, that's really what religion was like. It was so centered on the government, it was centered on the heads of the government. It had all these oppressive gods that if you didn't do your contract right, then something bad's going to happen, and so you had to deal with these gods to make it right. It's like in something like that. So the emperor worship then came into existence in about 29 BC with the Emperor Augustus. And so at that time, they began to, as a good citizen, can you imagine being a good citizen in the United States today? And you would be forced to go publicly somewhere and burn some incense or something in a ritualistic way to the President of the United States, or to the governor of Oregon, where I'm at now, or to something, Imagine if you're in China and you had to do that. Because that's really, if you think about China today, it's the religion of China is atheism, and they have an emperor now, and they're very patriotic religiously to the government, to the state. So you can imagine that was the world with which the Roman Empire was. And it was in a world like that Christianity took root. And that's good news, because that means that even in our world, no matter how secular it gets, no matter how distant it gets from God, if you could strike the fires of Christianity in the Roman Empire, then you probably could do it anywhere. So, number 3 fact about the Roman religion is Roman religion was purely external and based on rituals. So that means there was no component of Roman religion that had anything to do with morality or with conversion of the person involved. None of that was even a factor. All of it was external. And I'll give you an example of how it was ritualistic. The Roman then could not conceive of religious services that didn't have temples, that didn't have altars, that didn't have images, and didn't have sacrifices. Can you picture that? So if you were a Roman, you had to have temples, altars, you had to have sacrifices and rituals. And you had to see those rituals being done. If you didn't see that, then you weren't really at church that day. A perfect example of that is the god Vesta. The god Vesta was one of these gods that was worshipped or venerated in the Roman Empire, and she was served by what were called Vestal virgins. That's right. They were young girls, obviously very young, who literally gave their life to serve and do rituals in a temple to this god Vesta. Now, why would they want to do that? And why was this such an important religion or god for the Roman Empire? Well, if these girls didn't do their job right and then what could happen is the Roman Empire would be destroyed. In other words, they thought the entire empire doing these rituals was necessary, otherwise there's going to be destruction of the empire. And that's kind of how their religion worked. And so when you think about early Christianity, and biblical Christianity, for that matter, biblical Christianity had no impressive temples, there were no altars, there were no images, there was no sacrifices, there was no rituals that were done, and as a point, the Romans looked in the 2nd century when the Christians were separated from the synagogue and they were out on their own, as the Romans were looking at these Christians, they began to think of them as atheists, believe it or not, because they didn't have temples, they didn't have altars, they didn't have sacrifices, they didn't have images that they were dealing with. And so, I guess these guys are atheists. Isn't that interesting? You see, and atheism was a serious offense in the Roman Empire, as well as a refusal to worship the emperor, which was considered high treason. So to be a good citizen, because the religion itself was centered on the state and on the great leader, the emperor, then that meant that if you were not doing those things, you were somehow seditious. And that's how Christians were thought of 2nd century and 3rd century until we get to 313 when suddenly Constantine legalized it. Another thing about the religion of the Roman Empire that's important to understand is that how was the family life associated with it? And Roman family life was very corrupt, according to Qualbein. He says that religion had no moral component to it. And what we see in the prevailing society as a result was there was infanticide, infidelity, divorce, and infanticide is like our modern abortion, except in this case, the lady would deliver the child, and then they would take it outside and just let it out there, essentially, to die. In other words, just take it and put it somewhere where you can't see it and let it die. That's what infanticide was. Christians that were practicing proclaimed in their message the sacredness of 2 things: life, thou shalt not kill, and marriage, because marriage is tied to creation. And biblical Christians were creationists. They believed in creation. And so they were actually opposed to all the socially what was happening in the empire. So the religion of Christianity, again, was at odds with the religion of the Roman Empire. Dr. Qualbein writes, quote, "This elevation of Christianity made Constantine the first representative of a Christian theocracy, a policy that involved that all subjects are Christians and that the church and the state were two arms of the one and the same divine government." This is really interesting. So this is where Christianity entered a brand new phase, when Constantine claimed that the church and the state are now together. Can you imagine? And then he said, Constantine continued as the supreme pontiff, the first one, of the religious affairs of the state, and he called himself the Bishop of Bishops, according to Qualbein. And so here's where we find one of the most major changes to Christianity that ever took place happened when this emperor legalized it, and then he began to say that it belongs to the state. It belongs to the state religion. Isn't that interesting? According to historian Daramid McCullough, he writes about this. He says, Constantine has often been understood as undergoing a conversion to Christianity. Then he says, this is an unfortunate word because it has all sorts of modern overtones which conceal the fact that Constantine's religious experience was like nothing which would be today recognized as a conversion. Constantine told Eusebius of Caesarea that on a crucial experience in his Melvinian bridge victory had been a vision of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun and the inscription, "Conquer by this." Remember that last time, the first time that Christianity was associated with violence, and violence then became the method of missions for Christianity ever since that day. The association of the sun and the cross, however, is of no accident. You see, Dr. McCullough is saying that Constantine was actually a sun god worshiper, and to see the sun and this cross and conquer by this wasn't an accident. He goes on to say this about Constantine. Okay, back up. A military leader and a ruthless politician rather than an abstract thinker, Constantine was probably not very clear about the difference between a universal sun cult and the Christian God. So what this historian is telling us is that Constantine probably didn't understand what he was doing with Christianity, and he equated it to the religions of his day, especially the ones he favored, which was the sun cult. And so as Constantine now becomes the emperor and the Pontificus Maximus, the first pope, if you will, of Christianity, the first emperor of Christianity, we entered into this imperial stage. And when we entered into this stage, things began to change in Christianity. The first, of course, was compromise. According to Qualbein, he says, did the church in this era remain true to her divinely appointed mission by permitting herself to be adopted by the state church? In general, it may be said that while the masses were Christianized, in other words, you had to be a Christian now that Constantine was the emperor, right? Masses were Christianized. The church, he says, was secularized and it was paganized. And so this is when that happened. And when you think about some of the things that happened in pagan world, what he writes is that there were several different things that occurred. First, there was the pagan polytheism, and the worship of the emperor led to worship of angels. They just basically substituted these other things for angels and their images and began calling them, oh, that's this angel and that's this angel. Another thing that happened was the pagan hero worship and found its counterpart in the Christian martyr and the saints. So the church then in this period develops an elaborate system of doctrines, really, of heavenly beings. Now think about this. These are dead people. This is why Plato's immortal soul, the sin of Jeroboam in Christianity, is seen at work in this period of time. Because they're taking dead people, they're calling martyrs, and they certainly could be, like John the Baptist and other things, and they're saying that they're in heaven now, and they have the same exact omnipotence and omniscience as God Himself. And they then can be evoked, and they can actually have various churches and various things that go with them. And one of the things that made this very powerful was this industry, and I call it the relic industry. In this period, martyrs became canonized saints. In other words, the church recognized them as special people, and then relics that they made up or whatever, wherever they got these things, began to be thought of as having miraculous powers. And that's interesting, isn't it? They began taking part of the creation and then turning it into a lucky rabbit's foot. And that's what happened during this period when Constantine took over. And this stuff is all over the world. I mean, you could actually go on a trip and see this stuff. You could go to France, for example, and see the Church of the Relic of St. John the Baptist in France. And as you walked into the church doors and you looked over at it, you probably can get a tour guide to take you through the magnificent structure, and then you'll walk over and show you the relic, and he'll tell you a tall tale about how this relic did this, or somebody touched that, or something happened here, and there was something miraculous that happened over there, and la-di-da-di-da. But this is what happened to Christianity. It became essentially superstitious. You know what I'm saying? You know, Christianity is not about superstition. It's about revelation. It's about the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's about the coming of God into this world. It's about the Messiah. But what happened in this period is they began to turn Christianity into superstition. And that's what this is when you look at relics and magic thingies like that. Perfect example of this one is this is a picture of a relic. And it was not a Roman Catholic relic. It was a relic from the Greek or the Orthodox Church. And it's the skull of a Persian princess. They called it a martyr saint. And the reason it was stolen, it was recently returned, by the way, is that they believed that it had the magic power of predicting the future. And so they didn't want these people to, the Roman Catholics apparently didn't want these people to have this relic, so they stole it from them. And of course, they should have known that it was going to be stolen, right? Because the relic could predict the future, right? So they should have known that that was going to happen, right? Am I right? So that they could have moved it over there. But anyway, the Roman Catholic Church only recently returned it to them, and now it's got its own special little spot in the Greek Orthodox Church, okay? Or the Russian Orthodox Church. I can't remember which one it is. But you know, friends, today there is an entire tourist industry that revolves around relics that come from this period of time. This picture you see up here is a church in New York City, and they're showing all their relics. So you could go into this one and get a tour and walk around and look at the relic here and the relic there. I mean, where in the world do they get these things, right? I mean, this certainly isn't the bone of John the Baptist. I guarantee you that in that church in France. So you can tell there's a little bit of showmanship here, and there's also a little bit of conmanship here. I'll give you an example. This church right here is I can't pronounce this New Mexico name. I'm going to try it. Chimeo. Try that. New Mexico. There's a church there. And the reason I looked it up was I was driving in the car one day, and I happened to flip through the radio, and there was an NPR thing about this church. And what they were doing was they were doing an expose of the fact that there were pilgrimages of people coming to this church. And I thought, well, why are they coming to this church? Oh, because they have dirt that is special. And this dirt somehow has magical powers, And, because in the church, obviously to make people think that, you walk into this place and they talked about there were, crutches that were hanging on the wall, and all kinds of little stories. And so they come in and they were talking about it, and there's this thing, and people come in with their whatevers, and they take spoons of this dirt to take it somewhere because it's got magic powers. See, this is what I'm saying. The church entered the age of superstition. Instead of revelation, it's superstition. That's what Constantine did. But to finish the story, and what made it really chuckle to me, and sad actually, was the fact that they said, well, what do you do to the priest there? What do you do when you run out of dirt? Because it's obviously not a very big box you got here with this dirt. He says, oh, not a problem. We just have it brought in by the truckloads and it's out back. As soon as we run out, we'll just fill it up again. And they'll come in there and they'll take that dirt. Can you see what I'm talking about? Yeah, it's a big change in Christianity. And by the way, the people commentating on this, they began to call Christianity moralistic therapeutic deism. I want you to think about that very carefully, because that's not what Christianity is. Christianity is revelation. It's power in Christ. But these people have turned it into something that it never should have been. And it started in the imperial era of Christian history. Okay. Another thing that happened in this period that was beginning to happen was the veneration of Mary. Mary is a counterpart in all of these paganistic environments. There were always female deities. Diana, Ashrath, there was always some female deity, a mother goddess. And in place of that, then, there was the idea of Mary. And Dr. Qualbein writes this. He says, the counterpart to the worship of a female divinity, the Great Mother, by all pagans in the lands around the Mediterranean, became Mary. And it was a fatal inheritance, he says. But he also says that this did not happen during the imperial era. During this period of time, Mary was simply regarded as a high ideal of women. But as we move into the next phase, which we're going to look at tomorrow night at 4 o'clock, you're going to find out that Mary really changed in status as we move forward in history. In fact, I just did a Google search on this word, these words, Mary, Queen of Heaven Church. And all these churches popped up, and not all of them are Roman Catholic. Some of them are Protestant. It just goes to show you the influence of paganism in Christianity. Now, one of the big things that Constantine did, remember, Constantine was a sun god worshiper and favored sun god worship. He enjoined the first Sunday blue law. It was a civil observance of Sunday as the quote-unquote venerable day of the sun, not S-O-N, but S-U-N, which was to be observed by all Christians. And this occurred in 315, according to Qualbein. And of course, we know that Constantine was still a sun god worshiper. This is his money right here, to the sun, my invincible companion. And this was a radical change, wasn't it? That we now have a changed day. If anybody ever asked you, well, when was it that the church went from the seventh day of the fourth commandment to Sunday as being sacred? Well, friend, it happened in the imperial era. After all, if this emperor, who claims to be now the Pontificus Maximus, the pontiff of all Christianity and the power of the state, if he says the day is Sunday, who is going to say no? The only ones that are going to say no are those on the fringes, those on the outside, those who are away from all this. But the ones on the inside, yep, Sunday sounds good to me. And this is how it started. Sunday sacredness is not something that came from the first century. It came from Constantine, from the imperial era. And that is a radical change away from a creator God and now towards something that is related to the state. And there was something else that changed, and this change was really a big change. There was a radical structural change of the church. Constantine organized or reorganized, I guess you could say, Constantine took the church and put organization around it that was based upon the organization that he saw in his